Okay, so by now you've opened your document for the predation lab. And in this lab, you're going to investigate how predation, or the act of a predator hunting its prey, affects a starving population of prey. So first, let's go through the background information and get a little bit more info about what we're learning about. So it says in 1970, the deer population of an island forest reserve, about 518 square kilometers in size, was about 2,000 animals, 2,000 deer. Although the island had excellent vegetation, plants for the deer to feed on, right? That's their resource, the plants that they're eating. The food supply obviously was limited, right? So last week we learned how food supply, in this case the plants, could be a limiting factor. What kind of limiting factor is that? Well, plants are living, right? So that would be a biotic limiting factor. So let's get back to the background, third line. So the forest management personnel feared that overgrazing, which is what occurs when wildlife eats too much vegetation before it can grow back, might lead to mass starvation of deer, right? So all this is saying is that the people who ran this island, right, and took care of this reserve were afraid that since there were too many deer, right, competing for that food supply, right? It might lead to overgrazing, which is just too many deer eating too much grass before it can grow back, right? Since the area on the island was too remote for hunters, the Wildlife Service decided to bring in natural predators to control the deer population. So the area, the island, was too remote, was too far away, too hard to access, right? For hunters to go and control wildlife, right, by hunting deer. The Wildlife Service, these people in charge of the wildlife on that reserve, decided to bring in natural predators, something that hunts the deer, to control the deer population, right, to limit it from growing. So we're here in the last couple of lines of the background. It says, it was hoped that natural predation would keep the deer population from becoming too large and also increase the deer quality or health, as predators often eliminate the weaker members of the herd. So in 1971, 10 wolves were flown into the island, right? These wolves would be the predators that would hunt their prey, the deer, on this island. So now we're going to see what else we have to do here. The results of this program are shown in Data Table 1 and Graph 1 under the Results section. So now what you're going to do is you're going to make a hypothesis. You're going to predict how predation would affect the number of starving deer on the island. And then if you see here in the hypothesis box, it gives you a sentence starter. If there is more or less predation on the island, right, the amount of wolves, then the number of starving deer will increase or decrease, right? So after you think the wolves were introduced to this island to eat, the deer, think about what would happen to the population size. Well, if there's more predators, they're eating more prey, probably would decrease, right? So then what would happen to the amount of resources available? Probably be more grass. So then what would happen to the amount of starving deer on the island? So make sure you take a second to type that in blue right here in this box. You can go ahead and pause and replay as needed, but I'm going to go on to the procedure. So procedure. Scientists gathered data as shown in Data Table 1 and Graph 1 between the years 1971, when the wolf population, predation, was first introduced to the island, through 1980. So let's take a look. All right, I see 1971, 1980 on the table, and then in the graph, 1971, 1980 on the bottom. Okay. Let's go back here. Second line in the procedure. They counted and recorded the wolf population, which is the number of wolves present on the island, and the deer population, or the number of deer on the island, the number of deer offspring, which are newborn deer born that year. So let's take a second and look here. All right, I see the wolf population is the second column, deer population is that third column, and then deer offspring would be the new additional deer born that year in this column. So let's see what these next three columns are. Let's go to the explanation. All right, so we're in the fourth line of the procedure. The number of deer that died due to predation, the number of deer that were eaten by wolves, and the number of deer that died due to starvation are also recorded. So I know that in 1971, for example, there were 400 less deer because they died due to predation or being eaten by wolves. And then there were still 100 deer that year that died due to starvation. Now let's see what this overall deer population change and this plus 300 number mean. So we're going to go back to the procedure. With this data, they then calculated the overall deer population change by adding the number of new deer that were born that year to the deer population, and then they had to subtract the number of deer that died that year due to both predation and starvation. The last column in the data table shows a plus or a minus in front of the number. The minus indicates the overall change, and I'm sorry, let me read that again. The last column in the data table shows a plus or a minus in front of the number that indicates the overall change in population of the number of deer living on the island. For example, in 1971, the overall deer population was plus 300. That means that overall the deer population increased by 300 deer total. This is why there are 2,300 deer present in 1972. So let's take a second and look, see how that looks in the data table. All right, so I see that in the beginning of 1971, there's 2,000 deer on the island, right? So they added the 800 offspring that were born that year, right? So that's 2,800. But then they had to subtract 400 deer because they died from predation. So then it will go down to 2,400. And then it subtracted also the number of deer who died due to starvation. So here I know 500 deer died due to starvation, 800 were born. 800 minus 500, 300 more. So that's why this 300, these remaining plus 300 deer were added to the total population, which is why here in 1972 there's 2,300 deer. And they did the same thing for the remaining 8 years of the study. So let's go to this bold part and see what we're going to do. In this lab, you'll analyze the data in data table 1 and graph 1 to investigate how predation, or the number of wolves hunting their prey, the deer, affects the number of deer who end up dying due to starvation. And you're going to complete this lab by doing the following. Create your hypothesis that predicts how predation will affect the number of deer who die from starvation between the years 1971 to, not 2980, 1980. Then you're going to analyze the data gathered by the scientists as shown in data table 1 and graph 1. You're going to answer the data analysis questions below that. And then after you analyze the data, you're going to write a CER in your discussion section, and that's outlined for you as well. Again, this assignment's due this Friday, the 10th, and it's going to be a summative lab grade. So I'm going to go and read the questions under the data analysis. Again, you can pause this and press play if you need to, because I'm not going to pause for time after I read each question. So number 1, describe what happened to the deer population between 1971 and 1980. So you can either use the graph to answer this, or you can use the deer population column, whoops, that'd be this one, in the data table. So you want to make sure that you answer in complete sentences and you cite specific examples from either the data table or the graph. How would I do that? Well, I could say something like, according to graph 1, the deer population, let's see what happens now. So it looks like it grew. Oops, that's the wolf population. This red line is the deer population. So it grew from 1971 to 1973, and then it started to decline after 1973. So that's all I'm going to write. The deer population continued to grow from 1971 to 1973, but then started to, and then I write the rest of my response there. Okay, so this is the kind of responses that me and Mr. Weisler are looking for when we're grading your labs. Number 2, in which year was deer starvation the greatest? Using the data presented and your knowledge of ecology, explain why so many deer died. Well, let's look at, this might be better to use the data table. So when are there the most starving deer? So I'm going to look at this column, number of deer dying due to starvation. I see this year it was 500. Okay, so I know there are a bunch of dying deer in 1973. And I know that if they're starving, that means that they must be competing for their food, right? So I'm going to look, let's see how big the population was. Well, it looks like that just so happens to be the year that there were the most deer on the island, or the population was the highest, right? So I'm going to combine what I know about overpopulation, or a really high population, resource competition for food, and how that could contribute to this high number of starving deer in my response for number 2. For number 3, what happened to the number of deer dying to starvation in 1971 to 1974? What happened to the number of starving deer after 1974? Again, this is just restating the question. In 1971 to 1974, the number of starving deer, let's see what happened. 71 to 74. Okay, we see it grew a little bit. Then what happened after then? Whoa. It declined and eventually stopped, right? So let's see. Continued to increase, but after 1974, right? Okay. Number 4, describe what happened to the wolf population between 1971 and 1980. Again, you're going to do the same kind of thing that we did with the deer population, either using the graph or the data table, just like we did with the deer, but for the wolves this time. Number 5, when was the wolf population the highest? How did the number of wolves affect the deer population then? So let's see, when is it the highest? Again, I'm just choosing to do the data table. Wolf population, looks like 1975, 28 wolves. This might have been the highest. And then let's look at the number of deer dying due to predation. Whoa, it eliminated a lot of deer that year, right?